Just one more second, and then we'll be on here. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you clear.
Okay. Oh, here we go. All right. So now we're recording. All right. So I'm Raul, and I'm here with Anthony Pacheck once again. We're going to be talking about something that I believe we probably should talk about because it's all over social media and stuff. And so what happened just it was morning for us, but in Singapore, UFC had an event where it was being billed as like this wrestling versus jiu-jitsu MMA match against Damian Maia versus Ben Askren, right? So Ben Askren, a very, very accomplished amateur wrestler, against Damian Maia, it's a jiu-jitsu specialist who's being considered like one of the best at jiu-jitsu and MMA. Now, and of course with the win. So basically, yeah, he submitted Ben Askren, right? So now people can even argue even better that Maia is like the greatest jiu-jitsu practitioner in MMA. But again, I think even with our last conversation, I'd kind of like to add, and that's why I called Ben Askren an amateur wrestler. Not that that shouldn't necessarily be a negative thing, but I think that actually makes what I'm saying more precise, right? It's like, back in the day, an amateur wrestler would be the person who did like the folk style or the freestyle styles of wrestling. Basically, they weren't doing the submissions as well, like what the actual professionals did when professional wrestling was catch as catch can wrestling, where you beat the person by pinning them or submitting them. So with that being said, yeah, so you're not a MMA fighter. I'm not an MMA fighter. What are your thoughts on this match?
Yeah, just want to make sure I give that disclaimer out loud and clear. I am not an MMA fighter. We're going to be analyzing mixed martial arts. I've been an MMA fan for maybe like 15 years now, going on 15 years. So 50% of my life, I've been watching MMA. So take that for what you will. If you don't care about people's analysis of fights who don't fight, you can tune out right now. But I think we got some pretty good analysis on this subject. So yeah, Askren versus Maia. My thoughts. It was a tough one for Askren. I was pulling for Askren, obviously. If you've listened to our previous conversation, or just can tell by the Catch Wrestling Alliance channel name, I'm going to be pulling for Askren in this fight. Who I thought would win, my friend asked me, and I was like, gun to my head, I'm going to say Askren. But Damian Maia has just been in the UFC for so long, fighting, that it would be hard to discount Damian Maia in a fight like this. Of course, he's known as a pure grappler within mixed martial arts, but when you fight in the UFC for that long, you're going to have good striking. You're going to have good wrestling. There's no two ways around it. Askren, on the other hand, has been fighting for one fighting championship, which, I mean, he's been killing it, and the guys in one, are no slouch. I'm sure they could kick my ass. But I believe if you listen to like an interview, I think Askren did, he talks about how it was years ago when he was first getting into MMA. He was in talks with Dana White, talking about how he was like he was close to fighting in the UFC, and then something happened, something transpired. And from his side of the story, Dana White basically snubbed him and said he would never fight in the UFC. And so he was forced to take his talents elsewhere. Bellator, one fighting championship. And I mean, I like watching both of those organizations, but the talent pool just isn't as deep in one in Bellator. So he's been spending this time kind of in purgatory, fighting lesser fighters than he could have been fighting. And so when he finally does get the chance to come here to the UFC, he maybe doesn't have as tough a competition record that Damian Maia has been able to rack up. It's no excuse. I mean, he took the fight. It is what it is. But I think that merits being said. But I was stoked for the fight either way. That's one fight I've been wanting to see for a long, long time, was Damian Maia versus Ben Askren. And like I said, Gun to my head, I was picking Askren, but it was just kind of 50-50 for me. After the fight started and the bell rang and they were squaring off, my immediate first thoughts were, oh crap, Damian Maia looks a lot better than Ben Askren right now. Like this is kind of Damian Maia's fight to lose right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really considered this factor until the fight started, which is when two grapplers cancel each other out, it becomes a striking match. And generally, watching MMA fights, that's something I'll take into consideration. But I was just so stoked over the fact that they were fighting that I totally forgot about that aspect. And when you look at their striking, I think it was, I don't know, at least from my opinion, it's pretty clear that Damian Maia was getting the upper hand of the striking exchanges. Askren, he was basically just plodding forward, trying to get the clinch, taking a lot of shots, kind of very like Khabib-esque kind of approach, except without the sort of viciousness and more aggressive and violent intent that Khabib takes when he does that.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the story of the fight for me was Askren's striking, because he's basically plodding forward. He's getting to clinch situations, but how much damage is he taking on the way into these clinch situations? He was certainly landing a couple of good shots. Like he was flicking the jab out there. He landed the jab quite a bit. He got some nice, uppercuts in there. It almost looked like bare knuckle boxing uppercuts or something. It was kind of cool. So Askren's striking was basically, from a modern MMA standpoint, non-existent. He's plodding forward, trying to get the clinch, taking shots, and it was really sort of like Askren was the pure grappler in this situation, and Maia was the more like well-rounded MMA fighter, where Askren was solely trying to get the clinch and get the takedown, whereas from Maia's standpoint, he was content to just kind of keep distance and keep throwing pot shots and, landing on Askren for as long as, it takes. And then once Askren got the clinch and the takedown, then, Maia can work his guard from there. So that was kind of the story of the fight for me. And I do feel like, obviously Askren got some takedowns in there. He got to the clinch, he got the takedowns, but it really just took him too long to get to get to the clinch and get to the takedowns. And in that time, he was taking damage. So by the time it got to the ground, in the second and third rounds, Askren was tired and beat up from the striking. And even then, though, Askren, in my opinion, did pretty well on the ground, at least in the top position. In the bottom position, not so much. We can talk about that. Yeah, that was kind of the story for me. If you watch the fight back, Askren gets the fight to the ground, I believe, in each round, but it takes him like a whole round to do so. And he ends, I believe, the first two rounds on top. And so when it went to the ground, when Askren was on top, I wasn't too terribly displeased with it. He got swept. He got reversed. I was liking it. I was liking it. And until he got submitted, when Askren was in top, I thought he was doing a good job. He passed. There was a sequence in there, I believe, in the second round where he passed Maia's guard one time, and he was like in a Kimura position. So yeah, there's I think there's a lot to be said for this fight. There's a lot you could really kind of dig in and analyze about it. But I enjoyed it. And obviously I would have liked Askren to win because I do like his style. I do find it intriguing, but it just wasn't the case this time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense too. Say Askren was never known for his striking ability or his striking acumen, right? So, but yeah, it's like say if you looked at Maia fighting even 5 years ago, he might have looked a little bit more like Ben Askren, right? Because he even had a title fight against Anderson Silva, right, back in the day, and couldn't do anything against him, right? And he just took all the hits and all that. And I believe it was the fifth round when Damian Maia actually tried to get aggressive and actually I think hit Silva a few times, but it's by that time it was already way too late. So yeah, all that time, fighting in UFC, it actually made Maia a better MMA fighter, right? And so yeah, it showed. But I think one thing that we can talk about specifically is actually it's like showing on the screen behind me is that final sequence, right? So True. At this point in the fight, you're already was like around 15 minutes in, so it's both guys are probably gonna be feeling a little bit of the fatigue, but I think it'd be good to kind of look at what happened, right? So Askren is able to take down Maia. Of course, Maia falls down onto his back, but as Askren is kind of going forward onto Maia, Maia is able to get a butterfly sweep on him, right? So I think that's one of the things that, like say in catch wrestling, if you don't have someone who knows how to do these things, say like butterfly guard or even kind of seated guard, like I believe it'd be good to train the people who do this all the time, right? Because then you'll better be aware of like how to shut that down, how to, and then granted, I wasn't Aspen in that case, um, and the butterfly sweep can happen pretty quickly if you're not like actively shutting it down. But I think that's something that, since we don't quite do that, it's not necessarily like exactly like a catch wrestling thing, especially starting from there. Maybe like we can do it where we have a double wrist lock on from standing, and then you turn around and you sit down and like elevate the person. Could kind of resemble like a butterfly sweep, but um, that I think that was kind of the beginning of the end for Askren, because basically Maia swept for a heel hook and didn't quite get it right, but then was still able to end up with back mount, got the body triangle, and then ended up with the submission. So I think it kind of started not necessarily with Askren's takedown, but with that inability to counter that butterfly. Uh, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, I would say besides Damian Maia's back control, the number one thing that you got to fear is Damian Maia's guard. It's a tough thing in the world of grappling. There's I'm getting some echo on my end. Hold on.
Let's see. How about there?
Check. Okay, yes, I'm good.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, yeah, it's gone. Yeah, it's a tough thing in the world of grappling because there's such a wide array of styles. We're here, we're catch wrestlers talking about catch wrestling. But then you've also got jiu-jitsu on the other end. You've got, folk style plus BJJ. There's a huge array of styles to train for, and, if let's say you're a straight catch wrestling team or catch wrestling gym, you're training catch wrestling. It's like, how are you supposed to train for a jiu-jitsu guy, if you're not training anybody in your gym to, play guard like this? You're not getting anybody to go to guard. It's a tough thing, and vice versa. If you're a jiu-jitsu gym, and you're training everybody straight jiu-jitsu, how are you supposed to train them for wrestling kind of scenarios? It's like you need to have one guy in there who can do it really well, but then how do you train that one guy? You got to get him from some other school. So it's a difficult thing, And Askren, in my opinion, he's definitely not a catch wrestler, but I would say he's very close to being it. He's obviously had a great folk style background, and he's got his own, style of folk style, which he just refers to as, funk style, folk style. And I see Askren's style as sort of like an in between, sort of like midway from folk style to catch wrestling. It's sort of like almost there, but it's not catch wrestling yet. He doesn't really have the submission arsenal from what we can see, or he hasn't been able to employ it at the very least. So yeah, he's folk style wrestling plus jiu-jitsu. And yeah, I've been saying it a lot. I've been talking about this a lot amongst my friends and sort of other catch wrestlers, which is the back control, the jiu-jitsu back control. And that's where Askren got beat here. Now, he obviously got pieced up a lot by the striking. And honestly, when he tapped out, it looked like he was just exhausted in the first place. And Ben isn't really known as being the greatest athlete in the world, anyways. You look in there, he's kind of flabby. So, but it still remains he got finished in that body triangle back control. And this is one thing. If there's one position that we as catch wrestlers need to be training in, it's the body triangle back control. You need to have people putting you in that position, starting from there and working your way out, because we absolutely 100% know that when you go against a jiu-jitsu guy, that is a position that they're going to be gunning for. Like, we know it. I'm sure there's some variation in there. Maybe some, jiu-jitsu guys don't employ it, but, the vast majority, especially in a no-gi situation, what they're going for. They're going to be looking to get your back at the first opportunity available, and then most of them, if their leg length, is enough to wrap around your body, they're going to be looking to lock up that body triangle, and then they're going to be looking to put in the rear naked choke. So it's a difficult thing to deal with, but it's very simple. We 100% know that this is going to be their strategy. So if you're a catch wrestler out there, you need to be having your opponents, you can train with jiu-jitsu guys or whatever, have them put you in the body triangle back control and work your way out. Get out of it, reverse it. There's actually a couple cool submissions, you could hit from there. It was kind of this classic. If you asked me beforehand how Damian Maia was going to finish this fight, I'd say he's going to be in back control with a rear naked choke. That's what he's known for, and that's what most jiu-jitsu guys are known for. So that, that's just something that we need to continue to work on, is fighting out of that position. And then, of course, dealing with the guard too. Like you're saying, that's a butterfly guard. And to a large extent, though, the guard has, at least in MMA, has largely sort of been dealt with. The fear of getting submitted from the guard isn't as great as it used to be. The fear of getting reversed from the guard isn't as great as it used to be. The passing and the top control and the submissions from that position have really come up over the years. Now, if it's Damian Maia, that threat is going to be increased. There's just no two ways around it. Askren was doing some interesting stuff from that butterfly guard. Like, he was tripoding up and he was like posting his head on the mat. And I saw a couple of analysts kind of giving him crap for it. But he was doing well. I think there's more there than you would think. Just because everyone else isn't doing it doesn't mean that it's not viable. Askren, he's got a weird style, anyways. But if you actually watch it back on top, he was having some success. It's just a really sort of tough scenario, because as a catch wrestling fan, I was rooting for him. I want Askren to sort of be that analog for catch wrestlers in MMA, but he's just not quite it. He's just not quite it.
Yeah, no, that's the excellent point, because that's kind of what I wanted to say too. It's like, yes, so like online, everyone's saying like, oh, well, this is like a wrestling versus jiu-jitsu thing, but it's like, hey, it's like wrestling was more than what you think of as wrestling. It's like, so that's why I want to try to at least continue adding the word amateur before it. So like, that was amateur wrestling, or maybe if I'm offending anybody by saying amateur, maybe we could think of a even more precise word, because a lot of these amateurs who compete, in the Olympics, they get paid, so you win prizes and all that. So maybe amateur is not the best word, but it's definitely not catch wrestling, right? So and it's of course it's not like WWE and stuff, but like you're saying, it's like, to have Askren represent wrestling, sure, yes, he can be representing like amateur wrestling, but it's not exactly catch wrestling. And yeah, I kind of thought, because someone asked me too before the fight what I thought would happen, and I was kind of thinking there was like Askren would win by lay and pray or whatever, like maybe just stay on top, and then Maia might not be able to get out, and like that's how the whole time passes, because that's kind of what he's done in other fights. So I was kind of thinking that was going to happen, like with that, which is basically the whole wrestling background, being on top, keeping that pressure, not allowing the guy out. but yeah, it didn't quite happen. And so it doesn't mean like we're like hating him right or disowning him completely, or
Yeah.
but we just want people to know that it's like, yeah, there's still different things, and I think that the catch wrestling um, perhaps could better prepare someone for that, like if we always have a lot of submissions there, submissions from different positions, so you can be even more aware of that. But then also, yeah, maybe even if you can train with someone who's really good at butterfly guard or seated guard stuff, I think that's well, truly, yeah, you don't quite see that so much because you'll see that a lot in nogi, right, where people can be doing all these different types of guards and stuff because there's no threat of the striking or whatever. But um, it's good to like at least be able to train with someone who can do these things really well, like these, like all these different seated guard stuff. But then also, like you're saying, like even the body triangle stuff, you gotta just get used to these different positions. Which say like in IBJJF, if you're competing against in those rules, you have to put both hooks in, right? So in order to get the point, so you might have someone stop it with both hooks in before going to body triangle, but they'll probably eventually then go to body triangle. Maybe they'll stop and collect their points, and then it is preferred to get that body triangle. So it's a common thing. So I think we got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, I definitely think so. One other thing I wanted to talk about too was Askren's bottom game, and this is one thing that I've really been. This has been my main point of interest lately in the world of catch wrestling is the bottom game, right? If you go on YouTube or you just talk to people about catch wrestling, the first things that are going to come, if someone kind of vaguely knows what they're talking about, the first things that are going to come up about catch wrestling is probably going to be the top game, right? I think that's what catch wrestling is most known for is the really good top game. And I think that's what translates the best into the world of BJJ and submission grappling. It's because when I first got started in BJJ, I was mixing wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and of course I started out with a really heavy top pressure, and then in jiu-jitsu you sort of taught to have a lighter top pressure, which wasn't really computing in my mind. And then I sort of saw some catch wrestling videos and how they were using the pressure along with submissions, and I was like, that's it, and that really clicked for me. And I think it clicks for a lot of people, And also, there's just kind of a wider array of submission holds. When you take into account wrist locks, neck crank, spine locks from the top position that you can employ. So I think that catch wrestling's top position is the most readily available thing if you're a jiu-jitsu guy that you can plug into your game without much change. Right. And then I would say, maybe as a tie or second place would be the takedowns of catch wrestling. What's cool about the takedowns of the standing game of catch wrestling is they take submissions into account. If you wrestled and then you got into jiu-jitsu, what probably happened to you the first couple times you're doing takedowns was you shot in and then the guy locked up a guillotine on you and then submitted you, or the guy locked up a kimura on you. Or the guy, dropped to a triangle, when you're shooting with your head to the outside, you're like, oh, what the hell? How do I deal with this? What's great about catch wrestling is it takes those things into account, so you're not necessarily barreling in as hard on your, takedowns as you would if you had a folk style background. It's a little bit more intelligent about taking people down safely without putting yourself into a submission hold scenario, right? So that's basically covered on the internet. At least from my perspective, we've got that covered. What is really not covered a lot is the bottom position, and I think that's where we saw Askren suffer the most because he was. It was almost like he was trying to decide between the two major modalities, and what I mean by that is two major modalities are when you're in bottom position, are you going to play face? Are you going to play facing your opponent, in a guard scenario, or are you going to play, facing the mat, in an all fours referee position type scenario. And what we saw was when Askren was in bottom position, he basically had little to no guard. Maia was getting to half guard, 3/4 mount really easily, and then to mount. And then what would happen once Maia got, to mount or almost mount, then that's when Askren would, turtle out and expose his back. And that's basically like the worst time to expose your back. You want to do it before then, right? If you're on bottom in mounts, against a really good jiu-jitsu guy, and then you decide to expose your back, you're basically giving him a free opportunity to sink the hooks in, flatten you out, and then put the body triangle and go for a naked choke. And that's exactly what happened in the third round. That's how Askren got finished in the third round against Maia. He was in bottom position, and I honestly really don't know what he was doing. I don't know if he was just cocky. He was like, oh, I'm going to reverse this guy, or what he had in mind. But he had this kind of open guard, half guard, not really doing much with it. Maia advanced to 3/4 mount and then got to mount. And then Askren then decided that's when it's time to, turn over and expose my back. And you just, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't get away with that, but man, you gotta pick. Either you're playing guard or you're, turtling out. Because if you wait that long and you let a jiu-jitsu guy get his legs around your waist in any kind of scenario, whether it's mount or back mount or like just even a basic closed guard scenario, you don't want jiu-jitsu guys there. And so what I would have liked to see from Askren on bottom is more proactivity in that bottom position. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe if he would have got off what he was trying to get off, we'd be having a different conversation right now. But you don't want to turtle out right into a leg right scenario, because then you got to fight out the leg rights. You want to get it done before that. And that's one thing. That's one really tough aspect to the catch wrestling bottom position. That's sort of hard to reconcile for a lot of people in their minds, especially if they come from a straight jiu-jitsu background. There are ways to go about it, and it's a really different philosophy than sort of playing guard. Basically, anytime I'm in bottom position and I'm playing that, I want to stop those hooks from coming in. If one hook comes in, I'm clearing it out. If two hooks come in, I'm clearing them out. And then getting back to my, turtle position and then hitting whatever I want to hit from there. Stand up, tripod, sit out, whatever I'm trying to go for. I'm doing it from a non-hook scenario. Now, there is a lot of stuff that you can do once the hooks are in, like tripod shakes. I've got a thing I call the scrape that I do, where when they put hooks in, I fall off to the side and I scrape and I kind of do a 180 back into their closed guard. So it's not to say that there isn't stuff you can do once the hooks are in, but you really want to avoid that. And so, yeah, I really feel what's sort of missing from Askren's game is that catch wrestling bottom position, which is basically folk style bottom position with respect to submissions. Kind of the same as standing. Takedowns with respect to submissions. Bottom position with respect to submissions. And he's done a really good job of integrating his wrestling into the rest of his game, his top game, his standing game. But the bottom game, at least from what we saw in this fight, I'll have to go back and maybe watch a couple of other Askren fights, but he really hasn't been on bottom that much, in his previous fights. So it's kind of hard. There's not a huge data set to work with. He's probably not getting put on bottom a lot in practice either. So that really kind of crystallized what I've been saying needs to be addressed hardcore in the world of catch wrestling is that bottom position, because we're not going to be respected by the MMA community or the jiu-jitsu community until that gets fleshed out and until it makes sense. And if you just do a basic catch wrestling search on YouTube, not a lot of the videos are bottom position. If there are bottom position, they're kind of like single techniques. There's not a real cohesive system to it. Now, I know, and that there is. We both understand how this works. We can see it, and you can see it if you watch folk style collegiate wrestlers in MMA. You can briefly see it. But a lot of times they're not in the bottom position very long because they're shelling out. They're standing up. They're briefly in the bottom position, so you don't get a lot of time to actually observe it. But we know it's there, and this fight really just kind of hit it home for me that that's what we as a community really need to focus on, is that bottom position, making it submission proof, and being able to teach it to jiu-jitsu people so that they can employ it and so that it makes sense.
Yeah, that'd be one really good way to like, well, get not only get that respect, but at least get them to understand a little bit better. Because yeah, right now if they're um, like if because yeah, I try not to hesitate. Like even when I'm rolling with somebody, I try not to hesitate like facing them. Right, I'm not gonna even like let them play that guard stuff. I just we'll go back to my turtle guard, right? But yeah, like in that match with Maia and Askren, that it could have been a thing that happened. Like he was maybe indecisive. Even in the post-fight interview, he said he maybe was a little too cocky, or he was looking past that fight a little bit. So that could have been the thing where he might have felt like, oh, I can do whatever. I can kind of play guard, but I think at least kind of like the way I feel when I'm rolling. If someone is kind of like in that last, well, let's see, yeah, so right here, right behind me, like so, Maya basically pinned him, right, and I don't like before he got into the body triangle. It's like for me in my mind, it's like, oh man, I'm getting pinned. Like I just don't want to be here, but I don't know if it was fatigue or whatever, but Askren wasn't even trying to really get much of wrist control. When he did go to referee's position, like his arms are really far away, like maybe trying to grab a wrist. So that would totally allow some jiu-jitsu guy to get their hooks in like much more easily because it's not, his elbows aren't in close and tight. They're really extended, and that also allowed Maia to sink the rear naked choke in. So yeah, it's like I don't know if there's kind of like if you're kind of acquiescing a little bit to the popularity of jiu-jitsu by kind of like staying in guard or letting someone pin you for a little bit, see if you can play whatever guard technique you learn. But um, it could be up to the individual. But me personally, I don't necessarily want to. I don't want to stay there. I know it's not necessarily my strength. Maybe I'll drill it or whatever, like in training or whatever, just so I know these techniques. But it's not going to be my go-to. I'm not going to just let someone pin me because even for self-defense aspect, so you don't necessarily want someone pinning you and like having their way on top. You really want to get out of that position.
Yeah. At the end of the day, this was a fight too. So their strikes are being thrown, and I think Damian might have beat him in the striking department. I think by the time it got to the ground, later on in the fight, Ben was beat up. He was tired. When he tapped, it was I'm not in there, but it really just kind of looked like he was freaking exhausted. He might have gone out there for like a second. I couldn't really tell. It sort of appeared like he might have went unconscious, or I'm not sure. Maybe he was just really exhausted. He's got kind of a weird face too, so it's kind of hard to determine what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at Maia's choke, like it was a pretty shallow choke. Like it was really just kind of only like on one side, and maybe I mean that's. If you want to get a good choke off, all you really need is half of the neck. You don't need the full neck. So maybe if he just had a really powerful squeeze and he was really digging in there, maybe that caused him to go unconscious. I'm not sure, but man, it just looked like Askren by the time it was over was just defeated, on kind of every level.
Yeah.
But that, and so, it's a fight. I'm not an MMA fighter. I'd love to see them in a grappling match, but at the same time, I honestly think Damian Maia would probably win the grappling match too, just based on kind of what we saw here today. I think, I'm looking at Askren like this. I think he's sort of like a lesser form of Khabib Nurmagomedov. He's sort of trying to implement the same game, but there's a lot that he's lacking that Khabib has. Khabib has that aggressiveness. When he's on the feet, Khabib's striking really isn't that great. You can make the argument that it's good for what he's trying to do, but he's taking shots to get in there and close the distance, but he's doing it aggressively. He's getting people's faces. He's vicious. He's got violent intent behind it. once Khabib gets in, he's got the takedowns. He really used the fence really well. We didn't really see a lot of fence work from Askren in this fight. I thought we might see more kind of fence work from him. Khabib gets up against the fence. He's right on it. He's vicious. He's getting in there. He's getting the takedown right away. He's getting that top control. He's not getting reversed on any, bull crap. He's staying on top. He's being vicious with the ground and pound too. He's getting to the ground and pound. He's got great submissions. We've seen Khabib hit a double wrist lock at least once in the UFC. He's probably got, I think he might have like one more in there somewhere. He's got suplexes and throws. So he's just really got the full arsenal. Whereas Askren is essentially trying to do the same thing that Khabib's trying to do. But he's really sort of an amateur. He's like amateur catch can, whereas Khabib is definitely more of a pro style catch can, where he's got the submission finishes, he's got the suplexes, and I'm sure Askren, no submissions and no suplexes, but we just haven't seen it in the cage. And so I think if we're looking at catch wrestlers in MMA, neither of these guys claim catch wrestling, but I think they're two very close sort of analogs for catch wrestling. But Askren is definitely more on the amateur side. He spent he's spent most of his career in folk style, and then he was, freestyle and jiu-jitsu. Whereas Khabib, he's got Sambo background, which contains submissions, so he was doing submissions from an early age. Freestyle wrestling, from an early age, which, has big throws, big suplexes. He's got a judo black belt, submissions, throws, combat sambo. So I think from an earlier age, Khabib was training those fight finishing techniques more than Askren is, whereas Askren is just more sort of about top control. And I think when Askren goes out there, he's really kind of just looking to lay and pray still. He's kind of looking to point fight still, whereas Khabib, he's got a lot of decisions, and people fear going 5 rounds or 3 rounds with Khabib. And he's not necessarily known as a finisher, but he's got much more violent intent and much more finishing instinct than Askren does. So I think that Askren Khabib separation is a really good crystallization of the amateur catch versus pro style catch can.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it too, because and that actually kind of goes along even when we look at other fights and other MMA fighters who've come from other Americans who've come from our collegiate system and stuff. I mean, we had in Bellator, it was a few months ago, Ed Ruth got submitted by a Gracie, triangle, right? So Ed Ruth was on top, right, and then Gracie threw up the legs, right, and then so we see these things where it's you could be raising a larger point where it's I would even argue that say if some guy came from another country and they only did folk style, right? But say we have Khabib if they only did freestyle, right? So we have Khabib not only doing the freestyle, but mixing in the combat sambo and even some of the judo, because judo has some submissions as well and stuff. So it's and I know the sambo people have argued this, well, maybe this could be the better style to be training if you want to do MMA later, right? Whereas, both freestyle and folk style, have all the submissions barred, so is kind of what you brought up earlier. It's well, maybe it isn't the folk style that's, if folk style is a great base, but if you don't have the submissions integrated already, then it's going to take a little while to learn all that, or even learn to recognize these submission attempts.
Yeah, and I think Askren is a great case of someone who, if we were in a better world where catch wrestling was just as plenty as, jiu-jitsu schools were, he would have been a great candidate for someone, to take right out of high school, right out of college, rather, and put him in a catch wrestling program, as opposed to a jiu-jitsu program. I think his ground game would be stellar. It'd be way better than it is right now. but that's just not the case. And he got into jiu-jitsu, and I think if there's any wrestler out there who would be good at absorbing jiu-jitsu, it would be Ben Askren. I think if we could have taken him out of college, put him in a catch wrestling program, got the submissions going right away, then I think we might be having a different conversation right now. Also, just a couple of good things I wanted to point out from Askren's performance was there was a moment, I forget which round it was, but he was in bottom mount. Maia had mount on him, and he hit this really cool kind of like posting escape where he just kind of posted on Maia's face or his chest or his neck area and just kind of hit like a little like hip heist, like technical stand-up kind of thing, and got to the top position. I thought that was good. And that's something, I'm gonna have to watch the tape back and see if that's something I can sort of work with. But that's, if someone's on you in mounts and they're not really pressuring you hard and they're not keeping the distance close and they're posturing up, there's a lot of space there that you can work with. And a lot of times, jiu-jitsu guys, even when they're not, fighting MMA and there's not punches involved, they'll posture up, because they're kind of trained to do that because they like to go for like collar chokes and stuff like that. And that's just kind of like how they're taught to be in mount a lot of times, is that high posture. And, if they're not giving you the pressure there, that's something that we as wrestlers can take real advantage of. Now you gotta watch out for, when you're coming up, arm bars and triangles and submissions. It's basically like when they posture up, they're kind of baiting you in a way. So you definitely have to watch out for, as you're coming up, them jumping into submissions on you. But I thought that was a really good point that the match that Askren had, which again, it's one of these things where it's like, oh, he's scrambling, it's scrambling. In my opinion, the term scrambling is used by people in grappling and wrestling anytime they see something they don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. It's maybe happening too fast. They don't know what it is. Oh, it's scrambling. And scrambling a lot of times is sort of associated with like lesser technique. Like, oh, you're just sort of like being really fast and really scrappy, and you're just sort of doing what you're kind of improvising. And that's not entirely untrue. I think true scrambling is that. When it's a true scramble, when it's both people are sort of in a state of improvisation and they're trying to claim the better position. But even in the world of folk style, a lot of stuff that Askren does gets called scrambling, and I just don't really get it. I mean, if you're practicing the technique and it's like you're training to do it, it's not scrambling. Scrambling is rather hard to sort of like teach and sort of prepare for. It's sort of like a true scramble scenario is something that kind of happens by accident, where both guys are kind of caught with their pants down, or they're scrambling to reclaim some semblance of order. Whereas, what Askren doing, these are legit techniques that he's got DVDs out on. So I don't consider it scrambling. I think he even calls it scrambling, I don't know. It's kind of bad terminology for me. And so, so like he posted and he came up and it was just a very simple mount escape. And I think that's something that when you're dealing with the body scissors, guard, top mount, back control, flattened back control, I consider these all body scissors positions, right? And I think I'm going to put out a video here pretty soon, just sort of, or maybe like a video series titled Dealing with the Body Scissors, right? Because if you can defeat the front and rear body scissors of a jiu-jitsu guy, you can defeat the jiu-jitsu guy, right? Because that's basically what they're gunning for. They are gunning for some kind of body scissors position, especially if you're a wrestler, you can employ pressure. They're going to default to these body scissors positions. These are the first positions they learn: close guard, top mount, back control, flattened back control. This is what they will default to. And it's sort of the same. It's sort of as difficult as it is a lot of times as dealing with leg riders in wrestling. With my sort of minimal high school wrestling experience, I wrestled for 4 years in high school. One thing that was always difficult to deal with on the beginner level was guys who could leg ride really well, because they can get the leg in and they can sort of make it they can really bog you down, and if someone's got the legs in, it's not a matter of exploding and hitting your moves fast or hitting your moves powerful. It's not a matter of those kind of things. It's a matter of actually knowing how to escape the position, and sometimes it requires patience. And wrestlers are generally always pushing the pace, trying to really take it to the opponent. But if someone gets legs in on you, you got to be a little bit more patient, and you've really got to know what you're doing. But if you are patient and you do know what you're doing, you can defeat them. And if someone is really putting a leg right on you, no matter how it is, whether it's back control, single leg ride, or if we're talking about like body scissors type of stuff, closed guard mount, it might take longer for you to get out, but the entire time they're really clinging to you and hanging on to you. And it's a pretty taxing thing. It's sort of like a leech, and it's trying to get a leech off your back, but once you do, you're going to be relatively home free. I kind of, there's this kind of principle I've been having floating around in my mind lately called the front door principle. And what this basically is, a lot of times in the world of jiu-jitsu, guys are always scheming for different ways that I can come in through the side door, come in through the back door, and not approach things directly, but really it's sort of gotten to the point in the world of jiu-jitsu and grappling where guys have amassed all these defenses on their side doors and their back door that a lot of times the front door is sort of left wide open, because they don't expect you to come in through the front door. And so when you're dealing with these body scissors type positions, that's just kind of something to keep in mind. Be patient. Don't think that you're going to be able to explode out. You got to know the position. You got to have at least a sort of minor understanding of what jiu-jitsu guys are going to do once they have their legs in. And that's just something that's going to be a continual battle for catch wrestlers versus jiu-jitsu guys. But it's a very simple thing. You know what they're going to do. You know what they're going to do. I think, a lot of times wrestlers games are more varied than jiu-jitsu guys games are. It might not seem like that. But really jiu-jitsu guys have a very simple strategy, and it's very sort of laid out and sort of formally. Step 1, step 2, step 3, pass the guard, take them out, take the back control, yada, yada, yada. It's relatively sort of standard across the board, whereas a wrestler, you might see more variation, but yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot the initial point that we started on. It kind of went down a rabbit hole there. So yeah, I don't know if you want to get us back on track. Feel free. I'll try to rein it in.
You've been talking for about this 3 hours.
Yeah.
No. I think all those points are actually really good, especially for someone who's listening. I mean, hopefully, whoever's listening, especially if they're not so well versed in catch wrestling, or if they're interested in catch wrestling, that they should understand. Yeah, we are more than just top game or takedowns or whatever. There is more method to our madness, but then also, like you just said, like even in the amateur wrestling, so even in folk style wrestling, I agree with you. The attacks are more varied because not only, well, a lot of times the goal is to control the person and then get them onto their back. So a lot of these like reversals to pinning the guy can be like submissions, right? Or even easily tweaked to make it more submission-like. So hopefully whoever's listening, knows that there is a wider world out there. Or even, was it like a couple months ago or something? Was it Keenan Cornelius talking about how like no-gi has very few techniques or something like that, or it's like it's less varied than the gi game because like you can wrap your gi around someone's leg, or there's all these different little variations that they can do, and whereas since no gi doesn't have a gi, then it's limited. But it could be speaking from what you're talking about, where it's like in jiu-jitsu, kind of across the board, it's true, like at the different schools that I've trained at as well, a lot of the principles are fundamentally the same. Yeah, you do want to, your goal, maybe try to take the back, go for that choke, or like you're saying, or if they're dominating you, try to get them into guard, break them down, or whatever. So I think because that's somewhat similar across the board, then maybe someone who's emerged from that environment might think like, oh well, if I'm a nogi, then since I can't be grabbing on the lapels and wrapping it around their legs or whatever, then there's less variation. But like we both know that there's tons of variation, and especially with the catch wrestling, and even trying to preserve like the pinning that we do as well. I mean, then those are stuff that can easily be uh, tweaked a little bit to get a submission in a no-gi situation, right? Where pins don't count. But I mean, at least you know you're still using a pin to get the submission at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a ton of variation in no-gi. I hear that a lot. That it doesn't contain as many techniques, as gi does, because there's the gi there, and there's all the gi chokes and gi manipulations. And in a sense, that's true. But what you also have to think about is the stuff that will work that is more probable to work in no-gi. I think it's a fair thing to say that anything you can do in no-gi, you can do in gi, but not vice versa, because the gi is non-existent. And that's true, but you also have to think, but also everybody isn't learning every single technique, and so you got to think about the stuff that's more probable, and I think there's plenty of techniques that are way more probable in no gi than they are in the gi, and could be considered quote no gi specific techniques, and a lot of that has to do with sort of like the gi sort of getting in the way a lot of times of certain techniques. That gi is there. A lot of times, techniques that you would do in no gi are really only highly probable if the gi isn't there, because it's really, if you're trying to like fit your hand into a certain place, or you're really trying to lock something, if that gi material isn't there, it's sort of like is this sort of general obstruction a lot of times to certain techniques, to where if there's something that I might do no gi that if I'm wearing a gi, I'm just like, it's not even worth going for, just because that gi is just going to be there and in the way. Whereas if it's not, we're both wearing Lycra or spandex or whatever, I can really make everything as tight as possible, and go for this specific. So yeah, I would say in a sense there are no gi specific techniques. They're just it's not that they aren't possible in the gi. It's just that they're way more probable in no gi. If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, I think we've been speaking for a long enough time. Hopefully, whoever's listening or watching made it the whole way. So we won't talk your ear off anymore, and then we'll probably try to find other topics. So if anybody who's listening has anything you'd like us to talk about, especially give the catch wrestling perspective on anything, either MMA or grappling, no-gi, whatever, or even amateur wrestling, whatever, just write it in the comments, and we'll be happy to address those. All right. So thanks for watching, and Anthony, thank you for chatting with me. So I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Raul. Anytime.